The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the presidential office in Ouagadougou as Ibrahim Traoré reviewed yet another folder marked urgent. The military captain turned president had barely slept in 3 days, his mind consumed by reports flooding in from the northern provinces. His aide, Lieutenant Sawadogo, stood at attention near the door, waiting for instructions. Traoré's fingers traced the numbers on the page before him. Water extraction permits, tonnage reports, chemical usage declarations. Something didn't add up. The mining companies operating in the Bouclé du Mouhoun region were reporting minimal water consumption, yet village chiefs from the same area were sending desperate messages about dried wells and contaminated rivers. "This makes no sense," Traoré muttered, pushing back from his desk. At 37 years old, he had learned to trust his instincts. Honed during years of fighting jihadist insurgents in the northern territories, the same gut feeling that had kept him alive in combat was now screaming that something was terribly wrong. Lieutenant Sawadogo cleared his throat. "You, Mr. President Nye, the Minister of Water and Environment, is requesting another meeting about the CFE collection issues." "The water tax?" Traoré's eyes narrowed. "Let me guess. The mining companies are still refusing to pay their full assessments?" "Correct, sir. They cite the stability clause in their contracts. Some claim the fees are unconstitutional. Others simply don't declare their actual water usage." Traoré stood and walked to the window overlooking the city. Ouagadougou sprawled beneath him, a growing capital hungry for resources and opportunities. Gold mining had transformed Burkina Faso's economy, making the landlocked nation Africa's 4th largest gold producer. But at what cost? His phone buzzed with an incoming message. It was from Colonel Ouedraogo, commander of the Northern Military Zone, a man Traoré had served with before the coup. The message was brief but alarming. "Chief from Namasigi village walked 3 kilometers to reach me. Says their water source dried completely last week. Mining operation upstream doubled in size. People are getting sick. Need immediate attention." That evening, Traoré called an emergency meeting with his cabinet. The room in the presidential palace was sparse, reflecting the austere leadership style he had adopted. While other presidents had lived in luxury, Traoré still received his captain's salary, a symbol of his commitment to his people. Minister Roger Barrow of Environment on Water and Sanitation arrived with thick folders under his arm. His face was drawn with worry. "Mr. President, the situation is worse than we initially reported. I've been gathering data from multiple sources, and there's a pattern emerging." Traoré gestured for him to continue. "The mining companies are extracting water at rates far beyond their permitted allocations. They're using motorized pumps to lower groundwater tables, diverting river flows, and discharging contaminated wastewater back into the Mouhoun and Nakambe rivers. The chemicals they use, cyanide and mercury, are showing up in drinking water wells dozens of kilometers downstream. How long has this been happening?" Traoré's voice was quiet, but everyone in the room recognized the controlled anger beneath it. "Based on the environmental samples we've collected, at least 5 years, maybe longer. The lobbying by the Chamber of Mines has been effective in preventing proper oversight. Every time we try to implement stronger regulations, we face resistance." Finance Minister Diallo spoke up. "Sir, we must also consider the economic implications. Gold mining contributes 15% to our GDP. The companies claim they're operating within their contractual rights." Traoré turned sharply. "Contractual rights that were negotiated when our country was desperate for investment. Contracts that gave foreign corporations advantages no rational nation would accept. Tell me, Minister, what good is 15% of GDP if our people don't have clean water to drink?" The room fell silent. Traoré made his decision. "I want complete transparency. Get me the actual extraction data, not what the companies report. Use satellite imagery, send inspection teams, interview local communities. I need the truth, and I need it within 1 week." As the ministers filed out, Traoré remained seated, his mind already forming a plan. If the official channels had been compromised by corruption and lobbying, he would have to take a different approach. He picked up his phone and called Colonel Ouedraogo. "I'm coming north," Traoré said simply. "But nobody can know in advance. Prepare a small security detail. We're going to see these mining operations ourselves." Chapter 2. The Unannounced Journey. 3 days later, before dawn broke over Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré climbed into an unmarked military vehicle. Instead of his usual convoy and presidential security detail, only 6 soldiers accompanied him, all men he had personally fought alongside. They wore plain fatigues with no insignia, weapons concealed beneath civilian jackets. Lieutenant Sawadogo sat in the passenger seat, studying maps of the northern mining regions. "Sir, we've identified 3 major operations in the Boucle du Muhun area. The largest is operated by Volta Resources International, a Canadian-registered company. They're extracting gold near the village of Namasigui. The drive north took them through changing landscapes. The paved roads of Ouagadougou gave way to red dirt highways, cutting through savanna grasslands. Small villages appeared like islands in an ocean of dried earth, their mud brick houses clustered around wells and gathering places. Everywhere Traoré looked, he saw signs of water scarcity, from the long lines at communal pumps to the dried riverbeds that should have been flowing this time of year. They stopped in a village called Lauda around midday. Traoré had insisted on speaking directly with villagers, not the local officials who might have been compromised. An elderly woman named Alizeta approached their vehicle, her weathered face showing surprise at seeing armed men in her village. "We're looking for honest answers about the water situation," Traoré said, keeping his identity concealed. "Can you tell us what's been happening?" Alizeta's eyes filled with tears. "The wells are dying one by one. I've lived here 64 years, raised 8 children, buried my husband. Never in my life have I seen water so scarce. We used to grow cereals, millet, sorghum. Now the crops fail because there's nothing to water them with. The rains come less, and when they do, the water disappears so quickly." "Do you know why?" Sawadogo asked gently. She pointed northwest toward a range of low hills. "The mining company. They came 7 years ago, promised jobs and development. Some of our young men work there now. But they built these huge pumps that run day and night. The river that used to flow past our village. It's just mud now in the dry season. And the water that does come through, it tastes wrong, makes children sick." Traoré felt his jaw tighten. "Has anyone from the government come to investigate?" "Officials came once, 2 years ago. They met with the company managers, took some water samples, then left. We never heard anything after that. When we complain, they tell us it's the climate change, the drought, but we know better. Now you can see the pipes the company installed, taking water from upstream of us." An older man joined the conversation, introducing himself as Inusa, a local farmer. "The company pays taxes to the government, we're told, but we see nothing from it. Our school has no clean water. The health clinic has to bring water in drums from 3 kilometers away. Meanwhile, the mining site has massive reservoirs, green lawns around their offices, even swimming pools for the foreign managers." Traoré thanked them and returned to the vehicle, his mind racing. Everything the villagers described matched the patterns in the reports he'd read, but hearing it directly, seeing the pain in their eyes, made it personal in a way statistics never could. They continued north as the sun climbed higher, the heat becoming oppressive. The landscape grew more arid, the vegetation sparser. Around 3 in the afternoon, they crested a hill and saw it. The Volta Resources International mining operations spread across the valley below. The contrast was stunning. Surrounding villages existed in desperate poverty, fighting over drops of water, while the mining complex looked like an oasis. Massive extraction pits scarred the earth, surrounded by processing facilities, administrative buildings, and holding ponds filled with chemicals. But what caught Traoré's attention were the water infrastructure elements. Huge pipes ran from the Mohoun River directly into the facility. Motorized pumps the size of houses worked continuously. Holding tanks larger than village water towers dotted the complex. "Sir, there's no way they're operating within their permitted water allocations," Sawadogo said, using binoculars to scan the site. "Those pumps alone could drain a small lake in a week." Traoré nodded grimly. "We're going in for a closer look, but we need to be smart about this. If they realize who I am, they'll shut everything down and hide evidence." They drove down toward the mining complex, approaching the main gate as if they were ordinary travelers. A private security guard, a local Burkinabe wearing a uniform with the VRI logo, stepped out of the checkpoint booth. "This is private property," the guard said in French. "No unauthorized access." Traoré kept his military bearing relaxed, his face calm. "We're environmental inspectors from Ouagadougou. Routine check on water usage compliance. You should have received notification." The guard looked confused. I haven't heard about any inspection. Let me call the site manager. No need to disturb him yet, Traoré said smoothly. We'll start with the public-facing areas. Check your posted permits and compliance certificates. Standard procedure. The guard hesitated, but ultimately waved them through. They drove slowly through the complex, Sawadogo discreetly taking photographs with his phone. What they saw confirmed their worst suspicions. Water flowed everywhere, seemingly without concern for conservation. Massive spray systems operated in the middle of the day, when evaporation was highest, watering decorative plants around administrative buildings. The processing facility had no visible water recycling infrastructure. Discharge pipes poured a constant stream of cloudy, chemical-laden water into a drainage channel that led back toward the river system. "This is criminal," one of the soldiers muttered from the back seat. They parked near what appeared to be the main administrative building. Through the windows, they could see a conference room where several people sat around a table, documents spread before them. Traoré recognized the type of meeting, one where comfortable decisions were made in air-conditioned rooms, far removed from the villagers walking 3 kilometers for water. Suddenly, a man in expensive clothing emerged from the building, trailed by 2 others. The lead man was tall, Western, probably in his 50s. He had the confident stride of someone used to being in charge. "You're not inspectors," the man said in accented French. "I know everyone from the Environmental Ministry. Who are you really?" Traoré stepped forward. "You're right. We're not from the ministry. We're here on behalf of the people of Burkina Faso, who are suffering while you drain their water resources." The man's face reddened. "This is harassment. We have full legal authority to operate here. We've paid every required fee, secured every necessary permit. If you have issues, take them up through proper channels. And those proper channels, as you call them, have been corrupted by your company's lobbying." Traoré shot back. "We have evidence of systematic water theft, environmental violations, and falsified reporting." More security personnel had appeared, surrounding Traoré's small group. The tension escalated quickly. The Western manager pulled out his phone. "I'm calling the regional governor. You'll be removed from this property and probably arrested for trespassing on a secured mining facility." Traoré allowed himself a slight smile. "Go ahead, make your call. But first, let me introduce myself properly." He pulled out his identification. "I am Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso, and you, sir, are under investigation for crimes against the Burkinabe people." The manager's face went pale. The security guards immediately backed away, recognizing they had surrounded their own president. The phone slipped from the manager's hand, clattering on the pavement. "Mr. President," and the man stammered, "I had no idea. This is completely irregular. So is stealing water from desperate villagers while you maintain golf course lawns and swimming pools," Traoré replied coldly. "So is dumping chemicals into rivers that children drink from. So is bribing officials to look the other way while you violate every environmental protection we have." More people emerged from the buildings now, drawn by the commotion. Traoré saw Burkinabe workers, local people who depended on these mining jobs, watching with wide eyes. He raised his voice so everyone could hear. "This operation is suspended, effective immediately. Pending a full investigation, all water extraction will cease within the hour. Any documents, records or computer files related to water usage, chemical disposal, and environmental compliance are now evidence. Anyone who attempts to destroy or hide information will be charged with obstruction." Colonel Ouedraogo, who had been waiting at a nearby military post, arrived with additional troops. The situation was secured within minutes. Traoré organized his people to begin documenting everything, from the pump capacities to the chemical storage facilities. As the sun set over the mining complex, casting long shadows across the extraction pits, Traoré stood at the edge of the operation and looked back toward the villages they had passed through. The people there had no idea yet that their president had heard their cries, but they would. This was just the beginning. Chapter 3. The Evidence Mounts. The military compound in Kaya, the regional capital, had been transformed into a command center overnight. Ibrahim Traoré had requisitioned the largest conference room, and now its walls were covered with maps, photographs, and charts documenting the scale of the water exploitation scheme. Satellite images showed the extent of water diversion infrastructure across the entire mining region. Documents seized from Volta Resources International revealed a systematic pattern of underreporting and regulatory evasion. Lieutenant Sawadogo coordinated teams of engineers and environmental scientists who had arrived from Ouagadougou. They worked through the night, analyzing samples, reviewing permit applications, and cross-referencing actual infrastructure against what had been officially approved. "Mr. President, you need to see this," called out Minister Barrow, who had joined them along with key members of the investigative team. He spread a series of water quality reports across a table. "These are official samples taken by the company's own environmental consultants over the past 3 years. Notice the readings for mercury and cyanide." Traoré studied the numbers. "Here they're all conveniently just below the legal thresholds." "Exactly. Now look at these." Barrow placed another set of reports beside them. "These are independent samples we collected yesterday from the same testing points. The mercury levels are 4 times higher than what the company reported. Cyanide concentrations exceed safety standards by a factor of 7. They falsified their own environmental monitoring," Traoré said quietly. "How deep does this go?" An analyst named Caboret, a young hydrologist from the University of Ouagadougou, approached with a laptop. "Sir, we've been analyzing the water extraction data. According to their permits, Volta Resources International is authorized to extract 50,000 cubic meters of water annually. Based on the pump capacities we measured and the operating schedules we found in their maintenance logs, they're actually extracting closer to 400,000 cubic meters." Traoré felt his anger building again, but he kept it controlled. Anger without discipline was useless. 8 times their legal allocation. What about the other mining operations in the region? "We're finding similar patterns everywhere we look," Caboret continued. "The scheme appears to be industry-wide. The companies report minimal water usage, pay reduced taxes based on those false declarations, and the CFE collection system has been systematically undermined through lobbying and corruption." Colonel Ouedraogo entered the room, his face grave. "Sir, we have a problem. I've received calls from 3 different officials in Ouagadougou, all demanding that you cease this investigation immediately. 2 of them mentioned potential economic consequences if we harass foreign investors." "Harass?" Traoré's voice was sharp. "They're destroying our water resources, poisoning our people, and bribing officials. That's not harassment. That's law enforcement." "I agree completely, sir, but you should know the pressure is building. The Chamber of Mines has issued a statement calling your actions unconstitutional and demanding due process. They're threatening to pull all mining investments from Burkina Faso." Traoré stood and walked to the window. Outside, Kaya was waking to a new day. Market vendors were setting up stalls, children in school uniforms walked past carrying water jugs, and the rhythms of ordinary life continued, unaware of the battle being fought on their behalf. "Let them threaten," Traoré said finally. "What's the point of foreign investment if it destroys the foundations of our society? Water is life. Without clean water, everything else collapses. Health, education, agriculture, everything." He turned back to his team. "I want to visit the water testing sites personally. I want to see exactly where these companies are dumping their chemicals. And I want to speak with more villagers, understand the full scope of the impact on communities." Later that morning, Traoré's convoy drove to a site about 8 kilometers from the VRI mining complex. Here, the Mouhoun River, usually one of Burkina Faso's few year-round water sources, flowed sluggishly through a landscape of exposed rocks and sandbanks. Dr. Ouedraogo, a water quality specialist, had set up testing equipment along the riverbank. "Mr. President, this stretch of river used to be deep enough for fishing and swimming," Dr. Ouedraogo explained. "Look at it now. The water flow has been reduced by 60% over the past 5 years, corresponding exactly with the expansion of mining operations upstream." She showed Traoré water samples collected at different points. The containers revealed a disturbing spectrum of colors, from murky brown to a sickly greenish tint. These samples contain sediment from erosion caused by mining infrastructure, trace elements of heavy metals, including mercury, arsenic, and lead, plus organic compounds from cyanide used in gold processing. "Is it safe to drink?" Traoré asked, though he already knew the answer. "Absolutely not, sir. Extended exposure to water at these contamination levels causes neurological damage, particularly in children. Kidney disease, developmental problems, and increased cancer rates. We're looking at a public health crisis that's been building for years." They walked along the riverbank, following the water downstream. About 2 kilometers from their starting point, they found a discharge pipe, partially hidden by vegetation but clearly marked with the VRI corporate logo. Chemical-laden water poured from the pipe directly into the river, creating a visible plume of discolored water. "This isn't even on their environmental impact assessment," Minister Barrow said, photographing the pipe. "They never declared this discharge point. All of their official documentation claims wastewater is treated in closed-system settling ponds, so they're not just exceeding their water extraction limits," Traoré said. "They're also hiding illegal discharge points to avoid treatment costs." One of the soldiers called out from further upstream, "Sir, there's something else you should see." They found what appeared to be an improvised dumping site. Barrels, partially buried and some split open, leaked chemical residues into the soil. The vegetation around the barrels had died, creating a circle of dead earth. Several barrels bore hazard symbols and labels, identifying them as cyanide transport containers. "This is environmental terrorism," Traoré said quietly. "They're killing our land, slowly but surely." Dr. Ouedraogo knelt beside one of the barrels, taking soil samples with gloved hands. "Mr. President, remediation of a site like this will take years and cost millions. The chemicals have already penetrated deep into the soil structure. They'll continue leaching into groundwater for decades." As they returned to the vehicles, Traoré's phone rang. It was his chief of staff in Ouagadougou. "Sir, the situation is escalating. The Canadian ambassador has requested an emergency meeting. The Chamber of Mines has filed a legal complaint with the Supreme Court, claiming you've exceeded your executive authority, and several ministers are concerned about the economic ramifications." Traoré listened quietly, then responded, "Tell the ambassador I'll meet with him when this investigation is complete, not before. As for the Chamber of Mines and their legal complaints, they can file whatever they want. And those ministers who are more worried about foreign investors than Burkinabe children drinking poisoned water? Perhaps they need to reconsider their priorities." He ended the call and addressed his team. "We're going to finish this investigation properly. I want detailed reports on every mining operation in the region, water extraction rates, chemical usage, discharge points, everything. We're going to expose the full extent of this scheme, and then we're going to hold people accountable." That evening, back in Kaya, Traoré held a video conference with technical experts from across Africa. He had reached out to colleagues in Ghana, where the Volta River terminated, and to environmental organizations that had documented similar issues in Mali and Niger. A Ghanaian water specialist, Dr. Mensah, appeared on the screen. "President Traoré, we've been tracking the degradation of the Volta River system for years. Your mining companies discharge directly into tributaries that flow to us. We've seen fish die-offs, crop failures in irrigation areas, and health problems in riverside communities. But every time we try to trace the pollution sources, we hit diplomatic walls. Those walls are coming down," Traoré assured him. "I need your help documenting the transboundary impacts. If we can show that this isn't just a Burkina Faso problem, but a regional environmental crime, we'll have stronger grounds for action." The collaborative investigation expanded. Teams worked around the clock, building a comprehensive case. They discovered that the water exploitation scheme involved at least 11 major mining companies operating across 4 regions. The economic scale was staggering. By underreporting their water usage, the companies had evaded approximately 300 million CFA francs in water taxes over 5 years. The environmental damage, when properly assessed, would cost billions to remediate. But perhaps most damning were the documents they found detailing the lobbying efforts. Internal company emails revealed coordinated campaigns to influence legislation, draft favorable contract terms, and even identify which government officials could be most easily swayed with financial incentives. One email chain, recovered from VRI's servers, was particularly revealing. It showed executives discussing strategies to delay implementation of the CFE water tax, including recommended payments to specific individuals in the Ministry of Mines and the National Environmental Assessment Office. "This is evidence of systematic corruption," Minister Barrow said as they reviewed the documents. "And it's not just environmental crime, it's a conspiracy involving foreign corporations and our own officials." Traoré nodded slowly. "Then we need to move carefully. If we expose this too quickly, the people implicated will destroy evidence and flee. We need to have everything documented, legally secured, before we go public. How long do you estimate? Asked Colonel Ouedraogo. 1 more week, Traoré decided. We'll use that time to complete the investigation, secure all evidence and prepare our case. Then we'll present everything to the nation and the international community. Let them try to dismiss it after that. As the meeting dispersed, Lieutenant Ouedraogo approached Traoré privately. Sir, you should know that not everyone in the government supports what you're doing. I've heard rumors of officials contacting the mining companies, warning them to prepare legal defenses. I know, Traoré said. That's why we're working so quickly. The moment we have enough evidence, we'll act. Until then, we keep everything tight. Chapter 4. Resistance and Revelation. The backlash began even before Traoré returned to Ouagadougou. Headlines in international business publications criticized his heavy-handed tactics and anti-investment policies. The Canadian government issued a formal diplomatic note expressing concern about the treatment of Canadian companies. Within Burkina Faso itself, the Chamber of Mines launched a coordinated public relations campaign. Full-page advertisements appeared in newspapers, warning of massive job losses if mining operations were disrupted. Radio programs featured interviews with mining company executives describing the baseless allegations and lack of due process. Some local officials, particularly those who had benefited from mining company largesse, publicly questioned the president's approach. But Traoré had spent years fighting an insurgency far more dangerous than corporate lobbying. He understood the importance of controlling the narrative. On the drive back to the capital, he called a trusted journalist, Aminata Ouedraogo, who had built a reputation for fearless reporting on government corruption and environmental issues. Aminata, I have a story for you, Traoré said when she answered. But you need to see everything for yourself. Can you come to Kaya tomorrow morning? The president personally calling me for an interview. Aminata's voice carried surprise and curiosity. What's happening up there? Come and see. Bring your best investigative team. I want you to document everything independently. What I'm about to show you, nobody will be able to dismiss as government propaganda. The next day, Aminata arrived with 3 colleagues, a cameraman, a photographer, and a reporter specializing in environmental issues. Traoré spent 6 hours with them, providing access to all the evidence his teams had collected. They visited the illegal discharge sites, interviewed villagers, reviewed the seized documents, and examined the water quality data. Aminata was shaken by what she saw. Mr. President, this is bigger than I imagined. How long has this been going on? At least 5 years, probably longer, Traoré replied. And it's not just one company. It's a systemic failure of oversight, enabled by corruption and prioritizing foreign investment over environmental protection. Why are you bringing this to us? You could announce this through official government channels, because the government channels have been compromised. Half my cabinet is afraid of the economic consequences. The other half has been lobbied so hard they can't see clearly anymore. I need the public to understand what's happening from a source they trust. That's you. Aminata's investigation, published 3 days later, sent shockwaves through Burkina Faso. Her newspaper devoted an entire special edition to the story, titled Poisoned Rivers, The True Cost of Gold. The coverage included aerial photographs of mining operations compared with dried village wells, interviews with sick children in hospital wards, and excerpts from the incriminating company emails. Television stations picked up the story. Within 24 hours, it was the only thing people in Ouagadougou talked about. Public opinion shifted dramatically. Street protests erupted, but not against Traoré. Instead, people marched demanding accountability from the mining companies and the officials who had protected them. University students organized a rally at Nation Square, the same location where historic demonstrations had shaped Burkina Faso's political destiny. Thousands attended, many carrying empty water jugs to symbolize the scarcity imposed on communities while mining companies wasted water freely. Professor Diallo, a respected historian and political commentator, addressed the crowd. For too long, we've been told that foreign investment is more important than our own well-being, that we must sacrifice our environment, our health, our water, to attract international capital. President Traoré is showing us another path, the path of sovereignty, where our resources benefit our people first. The international reaction was mixed. Western governments and business organizations criticized what they called resource nationalism and a disregard for contract sanctity. But across Africa and the global south, Traoré's actions resonated powerfully. Social media exploded with support, particularly from young people who saw him as a leader willing to stand up to neo-colonial extraction. Back in his office, Traoré convened another meeting with his cabinet, but this time the atmosphere was different. The public pressure had changed calculations. Ministers who had previously counseled caution now competed to show their support for the investigation. The evidence is overwhelming, Finance Minister Diallo said, his earlier concerns about economic impacts notably absent. We should pursue criminal charges against the company executives involved. And what about our own officials? Traoré asked pointedly. The documents show that people in our government accepted payments to facilitate this scheme. Are we going to ignore that? The room went silent. Everyone knew that prosecuting corrupt officials would be far more politically dangerous than going after foreign companies. Justice Minister Somé finally spoke. Sir, if we pursue that angle, we'll be opening up investigations that could reach high into the government. Some of these people have powerful connections. It could destabilize the administration. So could allowing them to continue betraying the nation. Traoré countered. I didn't take this position to protect corrupt officials. If the investigation leads to people in this government, then so be it. Justice can't be selective. He stood and paced the room. I want to be clear about our objectives. First, immediate cessation of illegal water extraction at all mining sites. Second, full environmental assessments and remediation plans for damaged areas. Third, criminal prosecution of corporate executives and government officials involved in the scheme. Fourth, renegotiation of mining contracts to ensure proper environmental protections and fair resource taxation. Those objectives could take years to achieve, noted Minister Barrot. Then we start today and work as long as necessary, Traoré replied. I'm also calling for international arbitration. The companies will claim we're violating investment treaties. Let them make their case in front of an independent tribunal. I'm confident the evidence speaks for itself. Over the following days, Traoré's government announced a comprehensive set of reforms. A new National Water Protection Agency would be established with independent funding and enforcement powers. Mining contracts would be reviewed and amended to close loopholes that had allowed exploitation. The environmental impact assessment process would be reformed, with independent monitors and public transparency requirements. Most controversially, Traoré announced that Burkina Faso would seek compensation from the mining companies for environmental damage, with the funds designated for water infrastructure development in affected communities. The amount sought was substantial, nearly $500 million. Based on conservative estimates of remediation costs, the mining companies responded with predictable outrage. Volta Resources International issued a statement calling the compensation demand extortionate and threatening to sue Burkina Faso in international courts. Other companies joined in, with the Chamber of Mines calling for sanctions against the government. But Traoré had anticipated this response. He reached out to other African leaders who had faced similar challenges with extractive industries. The presidents of Ghana, Sierra Leone, and the Democratic Republic of Congo privately expressed support, though most were cautious about making public statements that might affect their own mining sectors. One leader who offered full public support was John Mahama of Ghana, who had recently returned to power. During a televised interview, Mahama praised Traoré's actions. What President Traoré is doing in Burkina Faso is necessary and courageous. For too long, Africa has allowed its resources to be extracted under terms that would never be accepted in the developed world. Water security is a fundamental right. If mining operations threaten that, they must be regulated or stopped. This endorsement from a respected regional leader gave Traoré additional political cover. It signaled that his actions weren't isolated extremism, but part of a broader African movement toward resource sovereignty. Meanwhile, the investigation team had made another significant discovery. Among the seized documents were communications suggesting that some mining companies had been aware of security intelligence linking certain mining payments to insurgent groups operating in northern Burkina Faso. While not directly funding terrorism, the companies had been operating in areas where their security contractors made payments to local armed groups for protection, effectively funding the same insurgents that Traoré had fought as a military officer. This revelation added a security dimension to what had been primarily an environmental scandal. In a televised address to the nation, Traoré laid out these findings with careful precision. "Chassis, my fellow citizens," he began, his military bearing evident even in the formal suit he wore for the occasion. "Over the past 2 weeks, we have uncovered a systematic exploitation of our water resources by foreign mining corporations, but it's worse than that. Some of these same companies have been indirectly funding armed groups that terrorize our people, kill our soldiers, and destabilize our nation." He paused, letting the gravity of the accusation settle. "This is not just about environmental protection or fair taxation. This is about national sovereignty and security. We will not allow foreign entities to profit from our resources while simultaneously financing those who seek to destroy us." The speech resonated powerfully, particularly with the military and security services. Any remaining hesitation within government ranks evaporated. Traoré had successfully reframed the issue from an environmental dispute to a matter of national survival. If you're enjoying this story, consider subscribing to the channel so we can continue bringing you more content like this. Chapter 7. The confrontation intensifies. 3 weeks after his initial visit to the Volta Resources International mining site, Ibrahim Traoré stood in an improvised courtroom in Ouagadougou. The venue had been hastily arranged to handle the first wave of prosecutions related to the water exploitation scandal. The proceedings were being broadcast live, a deliberate choice to demonstrate transparency and public accountability. On trial were 8 individuals. 4 were executives from different mining companies, including the VRI site manager Traoré had confronted personally. The other 4 were Burkinabe government officials, including a deputy minister who had accepted substantial payments to delay environmental enforcement actions. The courtroom was packed with journalists, civil society observers, and representatives from affected communities. Outside, crowds gathered around screens set up in public squares to watch the proceedings. This was unprecedented in Burkina Faso, a public reckoning with corruption and environmental crime playing out in real time. The lead prosecutor, Marie Caboret, a fierce advocate with a reputation for taking on powerful interests, presented the government's case with methodical precision. Document after document was entered into evidence, each one building toward an overwhelming conclusion. The accused had deliberately conspired to evade environmental regulations and exploit Burkina Faso's water resources while enriching themselves. When it came time for defense arguments, the corporate lawyers employed a predictable strategy, claiming their clients had acted in good faith, relied on local consultants who misrepresented regulations, and followed industry-standard practices. The argument essentially boiled down to this: everyone else was doing it, so why single out their clients? Traoré watched from the back of the courtroom, refusing the elevated position that protocol demanded for a president. He wanted to observe as an ordinary citizen, to see justice at work without his presence influencing the proceedings. During a recess, Colonel Ouedraogo approached him discreetly. "Sir, we have a situation developing. There's been a coordinated media campaign launched internationally, portraying these proceedings as a political show trial. Major news networks are questioning the fairness of the process." Traoré wasn't surprised. "They'll say whatever protects corporate interests, but we've followed every legal procedure correctly. The evidence speaks for itself. Let them criticize. The truth will prevail." What Traoré didn't know was that behind the scenes, far more serious pressures were being applied. In European and North American capitals, diplomatic cables flew between foreign ministries. The mining companies, backed by their home governments, were preparing a coordinated response. Economic sanctions were being considered. Aid programs to Burkina Faso were being reviewed. Pressure was being applied through international financial institutions. The Canadian ambassador requested another meeting with Traoré's foreign minister. This time, the language was blunt. Canada expected its citizens to receive fair treatment. If the prosecutions continued, there would be consequences for bilateral relations. Similar messages came from other governments where mining companies were headquartered. But Traoré had prepared for this moment. He had spent his first 3 years in power systematically reducing Burkina Faso's dependence on Western institutions. The break with ECOWAS, the formation of the alliance of Sahel states with Mali and Niger, the rejection of IMF conditions, all of these moves had been building toward greater autonomy. He had allies now, relationships with China, Russia, and Turkey that provided alternative sources of investment and support. When his foreign minister briefed him on the diplomatic pressure, Traoré's response was calm. Tell them that Burkina Faso is a sovereign nation. We have the right and the duty to prosecute crimes committed on our territory, regardless of the nationality of the perpetrators. If they want to impose consequences, that's their choice. But we won't be intimidated into abandoning justice. Back in court, the proceedings reached a dramatic moment. One of the accused officials, facing overwhelming evidence against him, chose to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony revealed the inner workings of the corruption scheme in devastating detail. He described meetings where mining company representatives presented envelopes of cash, sometimes disguised as consulting fees or charitable donations. He explained how environmental reports were intentionally delayed or altered. He named names, including several senior officials who had not yet been charged. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Even those who had assumed corruption existed were stunned by the brazenness of what was being described. Judge Sankara, presiding over the trial, had to call for order multiple times. That evening, Traoré addressed the nation again, this time from his modest office rather than a formal setting. He spoke without notes, directly to the camera, his words coming from conviction rather than political calculation. Now, my brothers and sisters, what we're learning in that courtroom should shock us, but it shouldn't surprise us. For too long, we've accepted that corruption is just how things work, that foreign companies can buy influence, that our officials can sell our resources and our environment for personal gain. I say enough. This ends now. He leaned forward, his intensity palpable through the screen. Some people are calling me radical. They say I'm scaring away investment. They warn of economic consequences. Let me tell you what's truly radical: allowing companies to poison the water our children drink while those children die of preventable diseases. Watching villages struggle for every drop of water while mining executives swim in pools filled with that same water. Accepting money from corporations that fund the very terrorists we're fighting. That's radical. What we're doing is simply justice. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Social media exploded with support. Hashtags like Free Water Burkina Faso and Traoré Speaks Truth trended globally. In Ouagadougou and other major cities, spontaneous rallies erupted, with people taking to the streets to show solidarity with their president. But not everyone celebrated. In the wealthier neighborhoods where business elites lived, there was growing anxiety. Many of these individuals had benefited from the cozy relationships between government and mining companies. Now they watched nervously as the investigation expanded, wondering if their own dealings would come under scrutiny. The business community organized a delegation to meet with Traoré, led by some of Burkina Faso's most successful entrepreneurs. They came with a mix of concern and warning. "Mr. President," began Moussa Traoré, no relation, a textile magnate, "we respect what you're trying to do, but we're worried about the economic impact. Foreign investment has dried up. The stock exchange is volatile. If this continues, we could face a serious recession." Traoré listened patiently, then responded thoughtfully. "I understand your concerns. But tell me, what's the long-term economic value of resources we can't sustainably use? When the water is gone, when the land is poisoned, what will we have left to build an economy on?" "There has to be a balance," another businessman argued. "We need foreign capital for development. We can't just shut everyone out." "I'm not shutting anyone out," Traoré clarified. "I'm demanding fair terms. We'll still welcome investment, but it has to benefit Burkina Faso first. Clean water, environmental protection, fair taxation, these aren't radical demands. They're basic requirements for sustainable development." He stood, signaling the meeting was ending. "I know change is uncomfortable. It disrupts established systems, but the old systems were destroying us. What we're building now might be harder at first, but it will last, and it will be ours." As the businessmen left, their expressions mixed skepticism with grudging respect. They might not agree with Traoré's methods, but they couldn't deny his conviction. Meanwhile, in affected communities, change was already visible. The government had mobilized emergency water delivery systems to villages where mining operations had been suspended. Trucks carried clean water from uncontaminated sources. Temporary purification stations were set up near polluted rivers. Medical teams screened children for heavy metal poisoning. In Namasigi, where Traoré had first heard complaints about water shortages, a new reality was taking shape. With the VRI mine suspended, the Muhan River's flow was gradually recovering. Water tables in village wells were rising. The change wasn't dramatic yet, but the trajectory was clear. Alizeta, the elderly farmer Traoré had spoken with, stood by a newly installed community well, watching as clean water poured from a hand pump. Tears streamed down her weathered face. "I didn't believe it would happen," she said to a visiting journalist. "We've been forgotten for so long, but our president heard us. He came himself and saw what was happening. Now look, water again. Clean water." These stories, broadcast across Burkina Faso, countered the narrative of economic disaster being promoted by mining interests. They showed real people, real communities, beginning to recover from years of exploitation. But Traoré knew the battle was far from over. The mining companies were preparing legal challenges at international arbitration panels. Foreign governments were organizing economic pressure. Within his own government, there were still officials loyal to the old system who undermined reforms when they could. Late one night, reviewing intelligence reports in his office, Traoré found troubling information. There were indications that some mining companies, facing financial losses from the suspended operations, were exploring ways to destabilize his government. Nothing concrete yet, but enough warning signs to be concerning. Colonel Ouedraogo shared his worries. "Sir, we're picking up communications that suggest outside interests are looking for leverage against you. They might try to incite unrest, support opposition groups, anything to create pressure for you to back down. They've tried coups before," Traoré said calmly, referring to the various attempts to overthrow him since he took power. "None have succeeded. I trust our people understand what's at stake. The people support you overwhelmingly, sir. But people can be manipulated, especially if economic conditions worsen." Traoré nodded, acknowledging the reality. "That's why we need to show results quickly. The water quality improvements, the infrastructure projects, the prosecutions, all of it needs to happen fast enough that people see tangible benefits before the propaganda can take hold." He pulled up a map of Burkina Faso on his computer, marking the locations of various mining operations, water sources, and affected communities. It was a complex puzzle, requiring careful coordination across multiple government agencies and international partners. "We're fighting on so many fronts simultaneously," Traoré mused. "Legal battles, diplomatic pressure, internal corruption, public opinion, and still the underlying challenge of actually fixing the water systems. It's exhausting, but necessary," Ouedraogo reminded him. "And you're not alone. You have millions of people behind you, not just in Burkina Faso but across Africa. What you're doing here matters beyond our borders." Traoré appreciated the encouragement, though he knew the burden ultimately rested on his shoulders. Leadership meant making difficult decisions, accepting criticism, and persevering even when the path seemed impossible. As dawn broke over Ouagadougou, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Traoré prepared for another day of battles. The courtroom proceedings would continue. The international pressure would intensify. The work of rebuilding water infrastructure would proceed. And through it all, he would keep fighting for the simple principle that had guided him from the beginning. Burkina Faso's resources should serve Burkina Faso's people. Chapter 8. International Crossroads. The conference room at the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa was arranged for high-level diplomatic negotiations. Ibrahim Traoré sat on one side of the long table, flanked by his ministers and legal advisers. Across from him were representatives of 3 major mining companies, their corporate lawyers, and diplomats from their home governments. A panel of international arbitrators occupied the head of the table, tasked with mediating what had become one of the most significant investment disputes in recent African history. Traoré had agreed to this mediation reluctantly. His preference was to handle everything domestically, through Burkina Faso's own legal system, but the international pressure had become too intense to ignore entirely. His allies in the alliance of Sahel states had counseled that showing willingness to engage in dialogue would strengthen his position morally and politically, even if he made no substantive concessions. The lead arbitrator, Judge Mbeki, a distinguished South African jurist, opened the proceedings. We are here to find a path forward that respects both the sovereignty of Burkina Faso and the legitimate interests of companies that have invested significant capital in good faith. Let us begin with each side presenting their core positions. The mining companies went first. Their argument, delivered by an expensive London barrister, focused on contract sanctity, investment protections, and economic harm. They claimed that Burkina Faso's actions constituted expropriation without compensation, violation of bilateral investment treaties, and breach of contract. They sought restoration of their operations, compensation for losses, and guarantees against future interference. When it was Traoré's turn, he chose to speak personally rather than let his lawyers lead. He wanted the arbitrators to understand that this wasn't just a legal dispute, it was about fundamental rights and national survival. With respect to this tribunal, Traoré began, his French precise and measured, I want to be clear about what we're actually discussing. The companies claim we're violating their contracts, but those contracts were negotiated under duress, when Burkina Faso was desperate for investment and lacked the capacity to understand what we were signing away. They contain terms that no developed nation would ever accept. He opened a folder and pulled out documents. These contracts allow water extraction at rates that exceed what our environment can sustain. They grant tax advantages that deprive our treasury of revenues needed for public services. They limit our ability to enforce environmental protections. Most critically, they were negotiated by officials who were being actively bribed by these same companies. The corporate lawyers objected immediately, but Traoré continued, we have evidence of systematic corruption, which these proceedings have already heard. When contracts are secured through fraud and bribery, they are void under both our law and international law. The companies knew this, participated in it, and now claim to be victims when we seek justice. Judge Mbeki raised a hand for order. President Traoré, your government has made serious allegations. Can you substantiate them with specific evidence? We can and will, Traoré replied. He gestured to his legal team, who began distributing thick binders to the arbitrators. These contain communications between company executives discussing bribe payments, environmental reports that were falsified, and testimony from officials who participated in the corruption scheme. We're not making vague accusations, we have documentation. The mood in the room shifted as the arbitrators began reviewing the materials. Even the corporate lawyers seemed unsettled. This wasn't the usual investment dispute where both sides had reasonable positions. The evidence suggested systematic wrongdoing on a scale that was difficult to dismiss. During a break in the proceedings, Traoré stepped outside into the African Union Complex's gardens. The Addis Ababa air was cool and refreshing, a pleasant contrast to the tense atmosphere of the negotiation room. Minister Barrow joined him, looking thoughtful. Sir, I think the arbitrators are genuinely shocked by the evidence, Barrow said. Even the diplomats from the companies, home governments, seem uncomfortable. Good, Traoré replied. I want them to understand this isn't a political vendetta. It's about confronting real crimes that have real victims. The companies are requesting a private session with us, Barrow continued. They want to discuss potential settlement terms. Traoré considered this. What are they offering? They're not being specific yet, but the implication is they might accept some level of additional environmental regulation and increased taxation if we agree to let them resume operations. Absolutely not, Traoré said firmly. That resuming operations is contingent on complete compliance with our environmental standards, full payment of back taxes and penalties, and binding commitments to remediation. Those aren't negotiable points. When the mediation resumed, the company's representatives proposed a compromise. They would accept increased environmental monitoring, pay a portion of the disputed water taxes, and contribute to a fund for community development in affected areas. In exchange, they wanted immediate resumption of operations and immunity from further prosecution. Traoré listened to the proposal with a carefully neutral expression. Then he responded, his voice calm but unyielding. Your offer is unacceptable. You're essentially asking us to forgive crimes in exchange for minor concessions. That's not justice. That's extortion. Mr. President, the British barrister interjected, you must understand the practical realities. These operations employ thousands of Burkina Faso workers. They contribute significantly to your GDP. Prolonged suspension will harm your own economy. I understand the economic implications perfectly, Traoré replied. What you don't seem to understand is that no amount of economic benefit justifies destroying our water resources and poisoning our people. We'll find other ways to generate employment and revenue. We won't compromise on this. The Canadian diplomat spoke up, his tone diplomatic but clearly frustrated. President Traoré, our government has significant concerns about the treatment of Canadian companies and citizens. This situation is straining our bilateral relationship. Surely there's a middle ground where everyone's interests can be accommodated. Traoré turned to face him directly. Ambassador, with all due respect, your government's concerns ring hollow. When Canadian companies were extracting our resources and violating our laws, your government said nothing. Only when we demand accountability do you express concerns about bilateral relations. That tells me where your priorities truly lie. The tension in the room was palpable. Judge Mbeki attempted to steer things back toward productive dialogue, but it was clear that the positions were too far apart for easy resolution. During the lunch break, Traoré took a call from President Mahama of Ghana. Ibrahim, I'm watching your mediation, Mahama said. You're handling yourself well. But I want to give you some friendly advice. Don't let pride prevent a reasonable settlement. Sometimes partial victory is better than prolonged conflict. I appreciate the counsel, John, Traoré replied, but this isn't about pride. If I accept a weak compromise, it sends a message to every foreign company operating in Africa that they can violate our laws, bribe our officials, and ultimately negotiate their way out of consequences. That's the system I'm trying to change. I understand, Mahama said. Just remember, you're not just fighting for Burkina Faso. Your actions are being watched across the continent. Other leaders are taking notes. You succeed. It gives all of us more room to maneuver. You fail, it sets us all back. I know, Traoré said quietly. That's why I can't compromise on fundamental principles. Too much is at stake. The afternoon session brought a surprise. The German representative, whose country had one of the mining companies involved, took a different approach from his Canadian and British colleagues. He acknowledged that if the evidence of corruption was as extensive as presented, German law would also void such contracts. He suggested that perhaps the dispute wasn't really about whether crimes occurred, but about appropriate remedies and how to move forward constructively. This opened a new avenue for discussion. Judge Mbeki seized the opportunity, proposing a framework where the companies would accept full legal accountability for past actions while negotiating new terms for potential future operations. The old contracts would be voided due to corruption, but companies that wished to continue operating in Burkina Faso could apply for new permits under reformed regulations. Traoré found this approach more acceptable. It acknowledged wrongdoing without demanding immediate expulsion of all foreign mining investment. It allowed for accountability while creating a path forward. Over the next several hours, the outlines of a possible settlement emerged. Mining companies would admit to regulatory violations and pay substantial fines and back taxes, totaling over $200 million. They would fund remediation projects for environmental damage. Executives involved in bribery would face prosecution, though potentially in their home countries rather than Burkina Faso. In exchange, companies willing to operate under new, stricter regulations could apply for new permits after a comprehensive review process. It wasn't everything Traoré wanted. He had hoped to set precedents for even stronger accountability, but it was a significant victory nonetheless, representing a fundamental shift in the balance of power between African governments and foreign extractive industries. As the mediation concluded, Judge Mbeki expressed cautious optimism that a final agreement could be reached within weeks. Traoré returned to Ouagadougou, uncertain whether to feel vindicated or disappointed. He had forced major concessions from powerful interests, but the fight wasn't over. Chapter 9: Rebuilding and Resistance. The settlement agreement, when finally signed, was celebrated as a watershed moment for African resource sovereignty. Major international news organizations covered it extensively, with analysis pieces debating what it meant for future investment on the continent. Within Burkina Faso, the response was overwhelmingly positive. People saw it as validation of their president's uncompromising stance, but Traoré knew that signing the agreement was just the beginning. Now came the harder work of actually implementing reforms, rebuilding damaged water systems, and preventing future exploitation. He assembled a dedicated team to oversee what he called the National Water Recovery Initiative. The initiative had multiple components. First, immediate remediation of the most severely polluted sites, focusing on areas where children had been exposed to dangerous levels of mercury and cyanide. International environmental firms, vetted carefully to avoid conflicts of interest, were contracted to handle the technical aspects. Local communities were involved in oversight committees to ensure accountability. Second, construction of new water infrastructure in villages that had been neglected during the mining boom. This included drilling new wells in areas with safe aquifers, installing modern purification systems, and creating water storage facilities to protect against seasonal variations. Third, case establishment of the promised National Water Protection Agency with real enforcement powers. Traoré personally recruited its director, Dr. Ouedraogo, an environmental engineer who had spent years documenting mining violations and advocating for stronger regulations. She had been considered too radical by previous governments. That's exactly why Traoré wanted her. "I'm giving you a difficult job," Traoré told her at her appointment ceremony. "You'll face constant pressure from industry, from foreign governments, even from people in our own government who want to go back to business as usual. Can you handle that?" Dr. Ouedraogo smiled. "Mr. President, I've been fighting this battle my entire career. The difference now is I'll have the authority to actually enforce the law. Believe me, I'm ready." She proved it quickly. Within her first month, the Water Protection Agency conducted surprise inspections at several mining sites that had been granted provisional permits to resume limited operations. 2 were immediately shut down again for failing to meet agreed standards. The message was clear. The new rules would be enforced seriously. In affected communities, the changes were dramatic. In Namasigi, where Traoré had first encountered the crisis, a new water treatment facility was constructed using funds from the settlement. The facility could purify contaminated river water and distribute clean water to surrounding villages. On the day it opened, the entire community gathered for a celebration. Alizeta, now 73 years old, was honored as a guest of honor. She had become something of a symbol of the water crisis, her earlier interview with Traoré having been widely circulated. Now she stood beside the president as he inaugurated the facility. "This is what sovereignty looks like," Traoré said to the assembled crowd. "Not just political independence, but the practical ability to provide for our people's basic needs: water, health, dignity. These are not gifts from foreign companies or international institutions. They are rights we secure for ourselves." The crowd cheered, their enthusiasm genuine. For these villagers, the new water facility wasn't symbolic politics. It was the difference between health and sickness, between viable farms and barren fields, between staying in their homes and having to abandon their ancestral lands. But not everyone celebrated. In the capital feuds, business interests chafed under the new regulatory regime. The reformed mining code required extensive environmental impact assessments before any operation could begin. Companies had to post bonds to cover potential remediation costs. Water usage was strictly metered and taxed. Foreign executives complained that operating in Burkina Faso had become more expensive and complicated than almost anywhere else in Africa. Some companies simply left, deciding the new terms weren't profitable enough. This triggered exactly the economic concerns that Traoré's critics had warned about. Mining sector GDP dropped 20% in the first year after the reforms. Employment in the sector fell by thousands of jobs. Government revenues from mining taxes decreased initially, though they would eventually recover as new, properly taxed operations came online. These economic consequences gave ammunition to Traoré's opponents. In Parliament, opposition members demanded hearings on what they called the president's reckless economic policies. Independent newspapers, some funded by foreign interests, published critical editorials warning of impending economic crisis. During a contentious parliamentary session, opposition leader Antoine Zerbo delivered a scathing speech. "Mr. President, you've sacrificed thousands of jobs on the altar of your environmental crusade. Families are suffering. Young people can't find work. Foreign investors are fleeing. When will you admit that your approach has failed?" Traoré, Attending the session, as was his habit to maintain connection with the legislative branch, rose to respond. He spoke without notes, his military bearing evident even in the civilian suit he wore. Our representative Zerbo asks when I will admit failure. Let me ask him a question in return. When you visit the hospital in Kaya and see children no longer suffering from mercury poisoning, is that failure? When you go to Namasigui and see farmers able to irrigate their fields again, is that failure? When you look at the Muhan River flowing clean for the first time in a decade, is that failure? He paused, his gaze sweeping across the chamber. Yes, we've lost some jobs in mining, but we're creating new jobs in sustainable agriculture, in water management, in environmental restoration. Yes, some foreign companies left, but others, ones willing to operate responsibly, are arriving. The path we're on is harder, slower, but it's the right path, and I will not apologize for choosing our people's health over corporate profits. The speech was met with mixed reactions, applause from his supporters, stony silence from opponents. But outside Parliament, in the streets and villages, it resonated. People understood the trade-offs, and most supported the choice their president had made. International opinion was shifting too. Initially dismissive of Traoré's actions, many global environmental organizations now praised Burkina Faso as a model for balancing resource extraction with sustainability. The United Nations Environment Programme invited Traoré to present his approach at a major conference on sustainable development. Standing before an international audience in Geneva, Traoré delivered what would become one of his most quoted speeches. For too long, developing nations have been told we must choose between poverty and environmental destruction, that we must sacrifice our rivers, our air, our land to achieve economic growth. I reject that false choice. We can develop responsibly. We can welcome investment without surrendering our sovereignty. But it requires courage to challenge the established system. It requires willingness to endure short-term pain for long-term sustainability. The applause was sustained, and afterwards, representatives from several African nations approached him to discuss implementing similar reforms. Traoré saw an opportunity for regional cooperation. If multiple countries adopted similar standards, it would be harder for mining companies to play them off against each other, threatening to move operations if regulations became too strict. This led to negotiations for what became the Sahel Water and Resource Protection Treaty, signed by Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and eventually several other West African nations. The treaty established common environmental standards, mutual enforcement mechanisms, and coordinated oversight of extractive industries. It was a significant step toward the regional cooperation Traoré had long advocated. Back home, the work of rebuilding continued. One of the most ambitious projects was the rehabilitation of the Pura region, where decades of mining had left the worst environmental damage. The old Pura mine had closed years earlier, but left behind an open cyanide pit covering half a hectare, a toxic legacy that threatened both water and air quality. Dr. Ouedraogo's agency developed a comprehensive remediation plan. The cyanide pit would be neutralized using advanced chemical treatment, then sealed and covered. Contaminated soil would be removed and safely disposed of. The entire area would be replanted with native vegetation to prevent erosion and help purify groundwater over time. The project was expensive, funded by the settlement money from the mining companies, but it was necessary, both practically and symbolically. Traoré visited the site regularly during the remediation, insisting on seeing the progress personally. On one such visit, he encountered a group of former miners who had worked at Pura years earlier. They had lost their jobs when the mine closed and hadn't found equivalent employment since. One man, named Musa, spoke for the group. "Mr. President, we appreciate what you're doing for the environment, but we need jobs. Mining paid well. Now we struggle to feed our families." Traoré listened carefully. This was the human cost of transition. Real people caught between an unsustainable past and an uncertain future. I understand your situation, and you're right that we owe you more than just environmental cleanup. That's why we're creating training programs for alternative employment. The remediation work itself needs skilled labor. So does the construction of water infrastructure, the agricultural revitalization projects, the renewable energy installations we're planning. He put a hand on Musa's shoulder. The work exists. We just need to ensure our people have access to it. I'm personally committed to making sure communities that depended on mining aren't abandoned during this transition. This conversation led to another initiative, the Workers' Transition Program, providing training and placement assistance for people displaced from the mining sector. It wasn't perfect, and many workers found the new jobs paid less than mining had, but it represented an attempt to manage the social costs of reform rather than ignoring them. As the first anniversary of the water crisis investigation approached, Traoré's government organized a National Water Day celebration. Events were held across the country, focusing on water conservation, sustainable resource management, and the progress that had been made. The main event was in Ouagadougou's Nation Square, where Traoré addressed a massive crowd. 1 year ago, he began, we embarked on a difficult journey. We challenged powerful interests, faced international pressure, and made choices that many said would destroy our economy. Today, I stand before you to report on where that journey has taken us. He detailed the accomplishments: water quality improvements in major river systems, successful prosecution of corrupt officials and corporate executives, establishment of new environmental protections, and growing international support for Burkina Faso's approach. But he also acknowledged the challenges: economic disruption, ongoing legal battles, and the long road ahead to full recovery. We haven't solved every problem, Traoré concluded, but we've proven something important. We've shown that African nations can assert our sovereignty, protect our resources, and demand justice from those who exploit us. That's not just important for Burkina Faso. It's a message to the entire continent and the world. Our resources belong to us. Our future is ours to shape, and we will no longer accept terms that treat us as subjects rather than equals. The crowd's response was thunderous, a roar of approval that echoed across the square and, through broadcast media, across the nation. In that moment, Traoré felt the weight of his responsibilities, but also the strength that came from popular support. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew his people stood with him,